Some kind of intro. Well, and welcome back to a free flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature themes. This is the integral stage, unless you have a better name for it. I'm Layman Pascal, and we're doing our Liminal Cafe sub series where we casually get to know the high and the low of folks who consume, produce, interact with, and create across the overlapping developmental, transformational, and regenerative networks. Today we're going to play a Hot Ones inspired retro dance game called the Shadab, where every time I ask a question, we do an outdated dabbing posture and then take a little dab of the Persian hot sauce known as Farsam Shadab. And folks, the slogan on that hot sauce bottle, it says philosophy is a full contact sport. So strap in, you've been warned. Listen, man, let's start by exploring your status and role in the community. I believe in interacting with everyone in the field and making spaces for all kinds of characters, even though they don't always have to be the same spaces. But there are some characters I get a lot of questions about. People say to me, "Why are you enabling these monsters, Layman?" But monsters come in different types. And for some reason, you, Farsam, are in the top five of people who, although some folks really love you, other folks find you very problematic in our community spaces. Notably, some women who feel harassed and some older institutional white men who feel you're disrupting a more kind and professional space in which to build community around developmental and non dual themes. In fact, I recently saw a post about you that said, quote, "I would like to submit this troll for consideration for removal. He is poisonous to good faith inquiry and meaning making." That's pretty strong language. What's that all about? Why do you think you're perceived by some people with such critical intensity?
Wow. Persian hot sauce. That's spicy. Well, I am the sacred clown of the community, so sacred that I am actually not Farsam. So, this is actually another episode of Matt's World podcast, and we're going to flip the script here. Farsam is going to continue to be elusive in the podcast scene, continue to be unapologetic, and continue to exercise his role as a sacred clown, whether people like it or not. Do I think he owes some people an apology? Maybe. But I find his role in the community to actually be refreshing. I think he takes it a little bit too far sometimes, far some. Um, but yeah, so I'm not actually far some.
Okay, well, I guess if we're on your podcast, you ask the questions.
Okay, Layman. Um, what year did let's introduce metamodernism a little bit. Um, what year did it start?
I'm going to say 1888. Uh,
1888.
1888. I think the first legit metamodernist is Nietzsche. I just wrote a
Okay.
book about that. And then you start to get versions or like premonitions of it through a lot of the early part of the 20th century. Toward the latter half of the 20th century, you get some interesting phenomenon where I think some theatrical philosophy and some Black liberation philosophy start to bring these ideas out in a really interesting way. But most people would situate it in kind of like the mature Gen X zone, right? Where
Mm,
you start to get a David Foster Wallace. You start to get people who grew up with enough digital media and enough assimilation of the postmodern spirit to realize what they love about it and what's going wrong with it and try to resolve that in themselves. So I'm going to say if I had to, I'd say something like the 90s is when you really start to see some of the embodied avatars of metamodernism. And then as the millennium changes, you start to get people throwing the name around, finding that they resonate with it, and starting to flesh out the theories. And then somewhere around the mid 20 teens, you start to get a lot of crossover between these people. The name is circulating in public awareness. People are saying, is this the same as or different from integral movements or some of the other movements that are out there? And you start to get people like Brendan Graham Dempsey who are trying to do like a synoptic summary of what metamodernism is. There
I
start to be
I
some
just listened to
anthologies and
you.
journals. Yeah.
I just listened to you and Brendan yesterday. So and so it was a phenomenal interview. But anyway, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think like that's where I mean there's these different phases of it getting started is what I mean. In the last 5 years, it's really taken off in terms of explicitly meta modern films, doing great at the box office and winning Oscars, as well as the meta modernism anthology that I co-edited and the emergence of the meta modern journal. It's sort
Yeah.
of like solidified its presence in the last 5 years. Before that was a initial kind of feeling out what its relationship to other communities was, an attempt to say itself across multiple versions. But yeah, I think it goes back, 100, years if we want to do it that way.
Yeah, I like how you rolled it out in phases because I think it started in cutting edge intellectualism at first and then moved into more of a cultural um, movement over time. That's cool. So is Nietzsche, would you say he is a metamodernist then? Is he the first one?
I think he's the first prominent one you could make a plausible argument for in the Western philosophical canon. Like, I think to me, it's pretty solid that Nietzsche is critiquing modernity and critiquing responses to modernity and looking at something that's on the far side of that. He sees a problem in our inherited cultures. He sees modern secular culture as perpetuating that same problem without realizing it. And he sees that same problem embodied in the people who think they're going to critique and fix and go beyond modernity. So he's an explicit postmodernist who's looking at some kind of groove, some kind of resonance, some kind of vibe that he thinks will allow value and the human and the spirit to be regenerated on the far side of all of that.
Interesting. And so along the same lines, when is postmodernism still going? Or is it started to fade a little bit? And when did that maybe happen?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because it gets into this problem that you see in developmental communities, which is
Mm.
how seriously, how solidly, or how loosely do we hold the relationship between individual cognitive and emotional development on the one hand and cultural development on the other? Because there's this thing in individuals that we want to think of as post-formal cognition, as the ability to be like plural and intercontextual in a real legit way. And then there's this thing we call postmodernism. And postmodernism is partly a reaction against the problems of modernity, but it's partly a bunch of people with this advanced form of cognition who live pretty nice lives and were able to promulgate cutting edge ideas. And then those ideas get passed on to new generations of people who take them up, but who don't necessarily have that organic capacity themselves. They're trying to learn it, but you get a culture that's populated by people who are aware of, but don't really instantiate that kind of thinking. So it's always been a question of how postmodern postmodernity really is. I think, in the
Mm.
sense that it's possible to be more authentically postmodern, that's still with us. That's an ongoing thing, that we actually need more people to get to, what integral and spiral dynamics would call green, right? That there's a authentic embodied pluralism, ecological awareness, intercontextual awareness, foreground, background switching, multiple variables of progress, all that stuff. I don't think we've even seen it beginning yet. I don't think it's a situation where like that's done and we've jumped past it yet. I think the meta modern has a kind of duty of care to try to encourage and keep healthy the ongoing emergence of the postmodern. However, as the dominant sort of academic description of what's going on in culture, I think that's faded away. And I think that faded away about the same time that smartphones emerged.
Yeah, damn smartphones. Um, it's interesting. I tried to get to partly out of my own competitive nature, and I'm retreating a little bit, but I like this idea of, well, I people call it hypermodernism or polymodernism. And then I'm like, well, if we're just going to name it whatever, I like to call it meso or mesomodernism. Um, Only for one small reason, because the term sincere irony never landed for me, and it's probably more of a misinterpretation on my part of what the authors and the movement is trying to say. But I always thought that the if you're going to oscillate between sincerity and and irony, how it doesn't seem that sincere in terms of like on an interpersonal level to be um I don't know, it's not dehumanizing, but in a way it lacks sincerity to be both sincere and ironic at the same time, much as Farsam's victims might agree that, okay, this might be ironic, but you're not being sincere right now. And so I've called it, I made make this move all the way to the pre-modern, where we're interacting with all of the layers of reality all of the time. And maybe that's what humans have been doing all along. But I don't know. I still am working a lot of that out in my head. Um, but I find the term interesting um, in terms of mathematics at the meso scale. That's where you predict weather, and that truly is kind of this intermediate zone in all of reality. Um, and so I find that fascinating. But like I said, it's probably just me um, not fully grasping some of the tenets and components of metamodernism. But anyway, um, tell us a little bit about yourself, Layman. I've heard your story a number of times. I know that you were born in British Columbia. Is that right?
That is correct. I like
Uh,
part of my brain is like hovering over here with responses to all that stuff you said about mesomodernism. I
if
don't have
you
to get
if
there. I'm just making it. I'm presenting that.
no, I'm usually not this nervous. I didn't have time to prepare since I was supposed to be Farsam, and he kind of dumped this on me overnight. But and so I don't
We can
have
come back to theory. Yes, I was born in
questions to go
British
through.
Columbia.
Okay, we'll come back to theory. That's cool. I was born in Portland, Oregon, so we share
Nice.
that Cascadia nature. It's the same kind of climate zone. So
Yeah, I was just out there a couple of weeks ago for a Meta gathering on the Sunshine Coast, which is a little north of Vancouver.
cool.
It's really nice for me to be back in that environment. Like I'm not compelled to live there, but my cells, it's like that the seascape of the Pacific Northwest Islands is always bubbling inside my cells. And when I
Mm.
get to be on those rocks and see those islands and see the water and see the seals and the crows and the eagles and everything, I'm like, oh right. It's that allows me to relax at a really deep level.
Yeah, it's definitely beautiful. From Northern California all the way up to Alaska, that's some of my favorite climate on the planet.
Yeah. It's got some of the biggest trees on the planet. I mean, it's kind of a since I left there, which was 7 or 8 years ago now, it's become more apocalyptic than I remember it. You know, when I turn on the news, it's always like forest fires, sudden storms, freezing rain, all these sort of things. But
Yeah,
when I grew up, it was sublimely mild.
yeah, yeah. I can't believe how hot it is in Portland already. Um, so, what was your favorite subject in school?
Like elementary school or like high school or like university-ish school.
Probably more high school, university, but feel free to touch on elementary.
All right. Yeah, it's hard to elementary is hard to gauge. You know, I was really good at math, but I hated it.
Mm,
I liked sort of cultural studies, social studies, that kind of stuff. I hated how they were teaching it to me, but I was always finding things I liked in the story. I liked religious history. I liked some stuff about war. I liked transformations, evolutions of human experience. Probably there was a guy named Mike Stack, and at my high school, he was an American, I think, draft dodger who'd come up years ago. Older guy. He taught advanced placement English lit, so I could like go to university and not have to do English. And he taught a course called Western Civilization, which was based on a book of that title by Sir Kenneth Clark. And we did that book, but we also did like Hitchcock movies and stuff. He had a really interesting take on it. And he was friends with the guy who ran the computer lab. And this was early days of internet and programming. They would share a chalkboard. And so I would go into my class and it would either have like stuff about the Holy Grail and faintly in the background of the chalkboard was like computer code, or there would be computer code and faintly in the background was stuff about the Holy Grail. So like
Wow.
my favorite class was like the intermixture of these two classes in the same room. But Mike Stack was great. He was a real kind of uh, culturally informed, aggressively masculine teacher who create a very strong contrast to a lot of the other teachers' sensibilities.
That's cool. Yeah, one of my favorite classes was sophomore English that when we did Shakespeare. So, and it's crazy how much the teachers really do make it, because
Yeah.
I hated English and I didn't have quite the conceptual understanding that I've grown to have through my own deconstructionism. Um, and so I was more of a math and chemistry guy. But so I wish I could go kind of redo English. I would go, I think I'd get a lot better grades on some of my papers. But
I relate to some of that because I was like, people always put me in English, right? They were like, and I would tell them, like, I don't want to be a writer. This is awful. I had no respect for writers. I just had an interesting relationship to language and was always formulating things linguistically in a unique way. But I thought I was going into hard sciences. I was, physics, I was chemistry, I was math, I was calculus, I was doing that. And people around me, including in my family, would say, why don't you take art? Why don't you take theater? And I'd be like, that's for fucking losers who can't think. Right? I had this kind of attitude. I'm like, I'm up here. That's for people who don't know what they're doing. But post high school, I look back and I'm like, that shit helped me. Math, chemistry, physics. I probably should have been in theater, man. That would have been fun.
yeah. So are you okay if I do a little bit of a Zach I can never say his last name.
Yeah.
Galifianakis. Oh, I can't do it. Style questions.
Galifianakis. Sure.
Galifianakis.
Yeah. But we're
Where,
between two Hermanskis.
yeah, where I'm not, where I'm borderline just kind of, you know, so don't, okay, so you're not going to take it personally. So did you get a 4.0?
No.
No.
Uh,
Oh.
I did. I did. I like there was a mixture of kinds of things. Once I got to university, I already didn't give a shit about this thing. I was doing something different. In high school, I did.
Mm,
I was
Jokes.
probably like the third or tied for third best student in the school. And okay, so there was this girl named Kelly, and
Okay.
then there was this guy named Brad. And this guy named Brad and I tied for second place constantly. Kelly was just genetically, but also she put more work in than we did. Uh, Brad was kind of like a sociopath. He just wanted to like he came from a relatively wealthy family and just wanted to get good marks and didn't care how he got them. And I was always striving with this dude, but also I wanted to have fun. And as the grades of high school unfolded, my interests started to radically exceed the classroom, and I became a kind of roving character at the school who was still, still getting like like a 3.9 ish, that kind of thing. I was doing really strong, but I was also uh, taking every opportunity to make fun of or upend projects, to go into final exams with, like, one thing I did was I bought this huge jar of vinegar because I'd read some interesting studies on the relationship of the olfactory system to the primitive brain. And I'm like, I'm going to study by sniffing vinegar and reading this stuff. And then I'm going to take a giant tub of vinegar into the exam and I'm going to snort vinegar the entire exam. And that's going to trigger, right? And like, it didn't do great. Very often I would do these things on the final exams that would knock my grade down a little bit, a grade that I had sometimes I exceeded 100% in classes, and then like lost 10 or 50 on the final exam because it was a theater of investigative stunts for me. I was becoming increasingly religious and surrealistic as I went through it. So I'm surprised I maintained the grade average that I did when I was increasingly, like a performance artist within the stage of the high school.
I can see why you and Farsam are such good friends. um, that's cool. Did you play any sports?
Yeah, this is a funny thing, actually. So last year, maybe the year before, I don't know. We're finished up at the Metamodern Spirituality Lab in Vermont. I'm there an extra day. I go out to dinner with Brendan Dempsey and his wife, and I married them, so I got kind of like a close connection to
Oh,
those two. We go out to this bar in Vermont, and they're sitting with their backs to the bar, and I'm sitting over here, and there's like four screens showing the same baseball game. And I'm like, what the fuck is it about people who think that when you go out to eat, you want to also watch sports on a giant screen? It
that's
seemed
me.
okay, great. It's puzzled me my whole life. And so I said to them, like, what sports have you been in? And they're like, well, I did, one day of basketball or this kind of thing. And then they asked me, and I started listing. I'm like, oh, well, I was in 3 years of soccer school and I played rugby and I was on the swimming team for a couple of years and got all these awards. And I was in fencing and I was in wrestling and I took tennis lessons and I really liked badminton. Oh, and I did like track and field, and I won first place in the 100-meter dash and the whatever the one where you toss the ball. Like I started going through these things, and they're like, "Oh, you were a jock," and I'm like, "No, no, no." I never thought of myself as athletic at all. I never respected it, same as being a writer. But when they asked me that question, and listed out that thing, I thought, "Oh shit, I was involved in a lot of sports." And it did not occur to me at all. It never became part of my identity, but clearly I was strongly in that camp for a long time through elementary and high school.
What about art? What's your did you paint or watercolor, graffiti, or anything as a teenager or through college?
Yeah, art's a funny thing for me, and it's actually the theme of the Metamodern Spirituality Lab coming up in June. Art
I
and the
kn-
sacred.
I I know
So
your
it's
parents
been
were
on my mind.
artists.
My
Yeah.
parents were like casual artists.
Okay.
Like I've said this to people before, which is I don't think I could have conceived that being an artist was a thing because for me in my family, art was something that a normal person, your mother, your father, your brother, your cousin, just did once in a while.
Hmm.
Like my dad was, he was a fisherman, he was a tree planter, he sold all kinds of things. But once in a while, he would make a statue, right? Or once in a while, my mother would paint a picture. So I thought of art as something normal people do once in a while. It wasn't until high school that I started to fall in love with the radical art movements in Europe after the First World War, particularly the Surrealists. Very into painters, filmmakers, and poets at that time, like a lot of overly intellectual high school boys. And so my experience of it is that I periodically would go through art surges like the rest of my family. Um, Obviously writing, but I did for quite a while. I tried to paint on canvas and I participated in a live painting competition like 10, 15
Wow.
years ago. That was fun. But I had this feeling of like, I don't like canvas and I really don't like color. I like sharp black and whites. So I would do a lot of art, and then I became obsessed by the idea that I already knew my own style, and I started doing what I called inhumanist art, which was I wouldn't let my hand move if I felt familiar with the kind of line it was going to make. I was just like waiting for it to be able to make a move that I couldn't recognize. And around that same time, I started picking up discarded cupboard doors which was a very common thing in Victoria where I lived, and using them as canvases. And mostly what I would do is either conceptual pieces or surrealism, or I'd find driftwood that allowed me to see through it to some kind of entity. And then I would sketch the entity, and then I would do black and white drawings on these large discarded white cupboard doors, and then I would like leave them back around town, things like that. So my relationship to art was sort of like a casual version of the radical art movements of the 20s to the 40s.
That's awesome. I That resonates deeply with me. I really like well, first of all, my mom was an interior design major, so a lot of
Mm,
my art exposure was more architecture, was the way that a house and a room is set up. Or, there's art in that, and I also like. For me, I'm more of a mixed media guy. I have no specialty, but the art of integration, poetry is obviously art, writing is art, and I think that, I would say that um, one of your strongest art skills is just oration. You're kind of a world famous, world class orator, and so the art of speaking and choosing words is
mm.
something that resonates deeply with me. I was not an artist at all. I was a jock. I played sports every season I could in high school. It was either I had to get a job, or if I played a sport, I didn't have to get a job, and so I played a sport always. Um, but yeah, I did one last night. We can transition back to theory a little bit too with this. It's I said between oscillation and grounding, we encounter a groove of creation, but
Mm.
creation must be integrated into the real. Defining and living the real is our quest. And just some kind of meso-modernism theory, but it's kind of a double oscillation because I have between oscillation and grounding, which I don't know if that would mathematically make a trinity, because you know what I mean. You've got a double oscillation move going on, which just kind of forms a triangle. Um, and so I put the meso, I pinned it between two meta triangles, and so um, but that's really resonant for me. I you know, I've been talking about coming back from the edge of context, because so much of these metamodern labs are pushing context and pushing that boundary. It's almost like your first psychedelic trip, which is something I want to talk about a little later as well. Um, but if you stay, for some people, and for me personally, I'll be vulnerable. If you stay out on the edge of context for too long, you lose context. And so as I'm reconstructing, coming back from the edge of context, this grounding is very important. And so how do we ground? And that's kind of one of my critiques on the metamodernism, is how do we ground within so much perspective, and really integrate these tools. And I think some people with maybe what my girlfriend would say, big brain people, they can take all of the Wilbur stuff and integrate it into their normal life. But I think some people just get stuck in some of the rhetoric, and it's kind of like, what are we even talking about? How do we reintegrate? How do we now reconstruct ourselves back into a meaningful and, most importantly, healthy lifestyle? Um,
Yeah, let's circle back through all that stuff. The art of the voice, that's something that people have pointed out to me about myself my whole life. I certainly have some heroes who I thought, wow, that's what having a voice means, and I've
yeah,
wanted to be like that to a certain degree. I think I've been, because I identify increasingly in the meta shamanic zone, which is very threshold oriented, that I think I've
mhm,
occupied an in-between space relative to art. Like I've been less artistic than people who think they're artists, but more artistic about everything I do than people who don't think they're artists. Like I've
yeah.
constantly tried to blend that category. And I think that that's contributed a lot to things in me that are like that piece of cardboard you just showed, which is my personal attempt to work through what we might call vision logic architectures, right? That it's something that I move around in space in my mind, right, and then turn into diagrams and like, okay, now I've got the picture, and you run it out and it looks like mandalas, it looks like hieroglyphs. You're like, shit, I'm one of those guys. There've always been these guys. They're making this kind of, I'm an alchemist, right? And this is necessary for me to personally assimilate structures of this kind rather than just hear about them and parrot back somebody else's language. And
Mhm.
this becomes a big problem in these spaces. I mean, I don't know how problematic it is, right? In reality, people are coming in at different levels. If you're a conventional kind of person, you hear a thing and you go, okay, this is the thing. If you're a rational person, you're like, okay, fine, I'm just going to tactically use this somehow for my own purposes. If you're a visual logic person, you're like, oh, right. I have to connect that to my experiences, and then I have to do some kind of digestive process, and then I have to rework it and find my next vision logic move that is inspired by these ideas I'm hearing. And a lot of that is what allows you to like live this in your life. However, I think there are other things that allow that realization of these ideas. The first one is being around other people, especially people who have like a non-defensive, non-aggressive mood about this stuff. We're like, yeah,
Mhm.
it's casual, it's fun, it's interesting. We can play with it. We're not trying to assert it on anybody. And then there's also this multi-intelligence thing, which gets to the irony issue as well. I had a great conversation with Eric Davis, if you know who he is. He used to work for Wired, like a tech esoteric
Yeah,
weirdo
I
back.
think I've heard him on Michael Garfield's podcast, I believe.
Yeah, so we were talking a lot about irony in our discussion about spirituality and humor, and this notion of like there's an ironic intervention into the irony process itself that is possible, right? And meta modernism captures some of this. Like Bo Burnham captures this really well in some things, where you have the normal ability to be meta on your experience, then you have this extra ability to be meta, but you can go meta on that, and when you do that, then you turn it on or turn it off or turn it up or turn it down according to what works for you.
Mhm.
And so a lot of that is deciding where and when it's contextually appropriate to go to that level of reflection or not. And what I would add to that, because I think that's a common thing you find in some books about these sort of complexification of the cognitive architecture of this stuff. The thing
Mhm.
I would tend to add to that is it's multiple systems in a person, right? You're doing that just with your mind, or are you doing it with your heart? Are you doing it with your body? Are you doing it in your relationships? Are you doing it with nature? The more different systems of yourself that you're doing it with, the more it's actually landing in your life rather than staying up in an abstract code land.
Yeah, and that's to me that's the meso move is to because they they call it a hierarchy of complexity. You have different stages or different layers of an onion. Like you can go meta on meta is kind of the ultimate, and that integration of all of those layers at once, kind of through your environment, through your body, through the way that you just move in the world is really, I think, the goal in terms of like health. Um, but it is interesting um, to incorporate all of these layers and kind of all of this complexity into single aesthetics, you know what I mean?
Mm,
And I think that you see it, if I were to define meta modern or meso modern art, it kind of is very abstract and has the almost has a spiritual or shamanic feel to it, or excuse me, an alchemical feel to it, where you go, oh wow. But I mean, you can get that with anything. I'm a big believer that you know everything everything is spiritual, or everything can be seen as spiritual, and um if you want it to be, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but um no, that's cool. So yeah, I don't really know where to go from here. So how would you describe yourself, like if you're just meeting someone on a train, do you say, oh, I'm a meta modernist, or do you make it more personal to that person? Like if you had to build a resume, would you define yourself as an author? I guess I'm getting into a little more identity, and we've talked about your constructs of identity growing up a little bit, but at this point in your life, what would you say that you kind of do?
Yeah, that's a great question. In everyday circumstances, for resumes, for border crossings, for meeting randos on a train, it's I just say whatever I think is going to create a nice relationship with that person that's
It's
practical. I
relative.
don't worry about trying to define myself. However, I'm in a lot of situations where people are like, "Hey, please contribute an article," or "we want to help you publish your book," or whatever, and they go, "Can you send us a bio?" And they have different
Mm.
lengths, so you make different calculations for 500 words than you would for 100 words. I got a lot of positive feedback a few years ago when I started saying things like Layman Pascal used to be a integral theorist, meditation and yoga teacher, but he's feeling much better now.
That's funny. I actually think that I actually don't like myself for asking that question, because I think it's silly to put people in boxes like that, and to have to be forced, because we really should be different people depending on the context of how we're interacting. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I'm like, there's a list of things that I would probably foreground if I was trying to express what I do to people who I feel like are in my broader community. And then if it was outside that community, I would just do whatever worked for creating good relationships. But inside that community, I've written a couple of books. I've written a lot of articles in magazines and in anthologies. I'm doing these Substacks, so I've got to put author in there somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm teaching people in one-on-one consultations, and I'm running events. One of the things I'm doing that isn't in there is that I feel like I'm a roving zoological researcher about intersubjective fields at this point. Uh,
Zoological. You say
yeah, what I mean is like I go to spaces where people are doing we space practices or they're trying to create a field, and there's a lot of excitement about that. There's like maybe this is an important complementary or even successor to the traditional notion of a religious teacher or a monastery or something like that. Maybe
Mm.
this is a key to how we establish new coherent community on the other side of cultural fragmentation. So there's a lot of these experiments going on. And I show up in these places and I think, God, we know almost nothing about this. Like there's a handful of like we space experiments you can try, but I feel like I'm Darwin in the Galapagos. Like I feel like I'm like a primitive zoologist, and like what I can do is just like sketch a picture, see what it eats, see if it mates with anything. Like I'm kind of a descriptive naturalist scientist relative to these emergent experimental egregores.
Wow. I love your rhetoric. Um, so back to the whole ferns things. Did you party in high school? Were you somebody who dabbled in with drugs and alcohol?
Um, Not really. Like just at the end of high school, like I was
Yeah.
pretty straight edge, naturalistic, good boy, good student, sports player. I mean, doing crazy shit all the time, magical and surrealistic and consciousness changing experiments galore, but not drinking, not smoking, not going to parties, not using drugs. Um, right up till the end. Like I met a girl and then she could get things, right? So we started to play around with that. And I had read, I was very well read in the as I was privileged as a kid to meet Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary and a couple of these guys, and I
Wow.
read the books from the '60s, right? So when I went into drugs, I was like, oh, I know what drugs are, and everybody I met who was using drugs was like, well, that's not what it is. We're like taking a hit of acid and going to a party, and I'm like, no, 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 no. You take a massive dose and you confine yourself in the darkness in order to access hypertemporal experiences. I was like that guy, and then you fill like 5 notebooks with the results, right? And they're like,
Right.
no, man, we just hang out. So I was not casual about it. I was extremely parascientific about it.
That's
But
that
sort of the end of high school and then the next couple of years was my entheogenic experimentation phase.
Very cool. So where did you go to college then?
I went to the University of Victoria until I couldn't take it anymore.
Okay. Um,
Lived on campus, had a little room. Even though I didn't do drugs, I put the DMT molecule on this little whiteboard on my door. I
wow.
used to lower. I didn't know who lived in below me, but I used to lower messages in a bottle down, and then whoever was down there would write messages back, and they would come back up. So I mean, it was a lot of fun, but there was also something that seemed really useless and depressing about the whole post-secondary experience. Probably
Yeah.
different if I was training for a practical task. Most of my friends went to the college down the road, and it was not as intellectually elite, but it was actually just preparing them to do real things in the world. I was a little bit
Yeah.
jealous about that. And yet I saw statistics on the rates of university suicides, and I get it. Like it was a really like a
Yeah.
weight on everybody's heart, is what it seemed like.
Yeah. Very cool. Um, but yeah, it's kind of education is changing so much. You said a phrase earlier though about cultural fragmentation. Um, and maybe we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about technology and um, the coming of the smartphone. Do you see, I guess, how do you see us overcoming some of this cultural fragmentation in kind of the pits of the attention economy? And does it have to get worse before it gets better?
It doesn't have to, but it probably will.
Yeah,
I'm a big, I grew up trying to, as a Canadian, there's not a lot of famous philosophers, but we got Marshall McLuhan. That was a thing. So I paid a lot of attention to him and the notion of how our forms of communication media influence our brain structures and our sociocultural patterns. So I'm very interested in what electric communication tools have been doing to us in their various phases of unfolding, including the last couple. Very intense. I think it changes almost everything. But the question for me is sort of what do we traditionally do as a species to enfold these disruptions, right? The fact of disruption is not new, so that we either have things that are building a sacred shared social fabric or we don't. And it's not like you point to the problem and go, look, the problem. You're like, well, where's the thing that normally takes care of that problem, right? It's like looking at some kind of personal health crisis, like, oh, okay, I can't stand up anymore. You're like, well, are you doing any exercises? When was the last time
yeah,
you were at yoga class? Right. We have to look at what the normal adaptive processes are for disruption in these things, right? That we have to figure out how, and this is one way I would define metamodern spirituality anyway, is to rehumanize, renaturalize, and resacralize the world that has been handed to us through digital technology and postmodern sensibilities.
yeah. Beautiful.
I think there's a first you need cultural institutions. That's a big part of it. You need individuals who are sort of religious individuals in the sense that they propose an existential and developmental message that's independent of the normal polarized identities in a culture. I think you have to radically reground in ecological patterns.
Mm.
And I think you need sort of an intact eldership transmission culture so that people can intergenerationally adapt to these changes.
In terms of eldership, do you see traditional religion as being useful, or should like like or is I don't know. I guess I don't want to get into like religious beliefs, but um, what? Yeah, what do you have? I guess what qualifies someone as an elder of their community, and can that look a lot differently? I think a lot of the fragmentation comes from almost this attempt to unify truth. And if we can see that there is true a multiplicity of truths, that maybe it's not as fragmented, and maybe that's what a coherent pluralism is. Um, I don't know. I come from uh, a lineage where there's both good and bad elders within a religious structure, and so um, I guess on a personal note, I'm wondering, how do we find our elders if they're not necessarily given to us?
Yeah, elders is a very interesting topic because there's, first of all, you got to make the distinction between older and an elder, right? I think
Yes.
in a healthy village situation, which dominated for who knows, 20 or 100,000 years, depending on who you ask, a
Yeah.
person who lived longer knew more about how to live in that situation. And through repeated semi mythologized stories and songs, they passed it on. That was a great system. But I think it's much more complex now that elder and older are not necessarily the same. One of the things that undermines an eldership culture is when most of the older people you meet do not seem impressive or interesting or inwardly
Yeah.
alive in any way. Then there's healthy and unhealthy eldership. And then in a developmental context, there's like elders at different kinds of paradigmatic approaches to sense making, right?
Beautiful.
And then some of those are like, we've got a good eldership, but it only works for our community, or it only works for our ethnicity, or it only works for people who want to roll the clock back to when we were great again, or something like that. What we need is an eldership that can move forward across the membrane, the challenge that pluralism presents to us.
Mm,
And then what do we look for that? Well, I mean, you're looking for people who have a lot of hopefully unique experience in how they've worked with and assimilated multiple perspectives, multiple kinds of people, people who've struggled to bring their own parts, to include all of their real parts and try to work them together in some unique way, which again is very Nietzschean. You're looking for people who give the bodily sign of having an active nervous system. Like I'll tell you, when I look back, I think both my parents are like legit elders to me. But the first person that I thought, oh, that's an elder was Timothy Leary, right?
wow.
I saw this guy. He was an old guy. He was close to death at the time, but he was like dancing around on stage like a satyr, and his eyes were glowing. And you're like, whatever's going on, there's an active nervous system in there. That guy's still working, right? He's been working all this time, so he's been working for longer than I have on making sense of things that are both archaic and emerging. And there's liveliness, there's resilience, there's joy, there's interest, right? I'm like, that's what one of the things I'm looking for in an elder is there's some of that visceral glow is still there, and a person who can do that in the context of the new technology and in the context of a transcultural and hyper diverse social ethos, that's the kind of person we need to be looking for. And very often those people don't want to identify as elders because they don't want to assert themselves or they don't want to think of themselves as too old. I found you have to kind of trick people into being elders sometimes. So if you find somebody who could be an elder, whether they're spiritual or cultural or philosophical, you got to kind of like coax them into it. And by your practice of treating them as an elder, I think you get better. And then when the next generation comes, you're better at being an elder to them because you tried to practice doing it to the people before you, whether they wanted it or not.
Yeah. Well, I would say that many probably look to you as an elder. And so, speaking on behalf of the crowd, I would say we appreciate you and your eldership towards us. So, um, and also figures that aren't, you identify as kind of shamanic a little bit, and you and kind of explore a lot of those terrains. But I like how you said it isn't necessarily spiritual. You definitely you have people who have a specialty or are very knowledgeable and identify as spiritual, but then you have the Jim Rutts of the world, and he certainly is an elder in terms of a lot of more of the technology side of things. And so I think in the meta modern world, we have all sorts of elders, and you can have multiple elders too, depending on the subject. So
Yeah, I mean Jim Rutt, I love Jim. He's one of these great, he shows up as a persona,
he's my
which is
favorite.
fun. He likes to play a character. I think the one of the classical forms of the shaman is the sort of tech shaman. Like somebody made the temples and invented the codes and charted the stars, right? They weren't all just uh, taking drugs and studying their dreams. There's different subtypes of the organic human esoteric practitioner. And I definitely situate Jim in that discussion. Like he's a guy who like basically every year rereads the Bible and Lord of the Rings. So he's got like a naturalistic magical sensibility and a deeply religious sensibility. He's philosophical, he's metaphysical, he's interested in transformations of consciousness. He's interested in the level of complexity that goes beyond human egoic guessing and reaches into naturalistic patterns. I'm like, all of that is, I would argue, organically spiritual. We don't have to call it that. The names, the categories don't really matter. But that's a guy who's tried to live that life under the current world conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, if you were to call him spiritual, he'd reach for his pistol probably.
Yeah,
Oh,
I hosted the liminal roast of Jim Rutt. It was a real pleasure for me to make some jokes about him and also honor him as one of our elders.
yeah, yesterday was my birthday, but I think for my 40th birthday, I want to participate in the tradition of being roasted when I turn 40. So
Nice.
that'll be fun. So okay, let's finish by kind of going back to the community a little bit. We just talked about Jim. Um, I think I actually found you were one of his first guests back in like 2019 or something. And um, I stumbled across metamodernism and was more interested in intellectualism in general when I left the Mormon Church officially. I've always been a Jack Mormon since I was like 13. Um, but when I officially said, okay, what's really going on here? A lot of these truth claims about the church that I just kind of bought, and a lot of the covered up history, the whitewashing. Um, when I was became aware of a lot of that, I started into my deconstructionism. And then I found a podcast called Future Thinkers, and they had a guy named Jim Rutt on it. And then that was right when he started his podcast. And then I've listened to 90% of it ever since then, the last, 7, 8 years. And I've been aware of you, that whole time as well. And so I kind of stumbled into this whole metamodernism accidentally through that channel. And so it's it is an interesting community though, and I think it's important. Something that I'm working on, is not just having it be an online thing, not just having it be listening to podcasts, but trying to integrate it, for lack of a better word. But it is interesting, the online space, and do you? I guess what are your thoughts on Farsam and his hot sauce nature? Do you see him as a king's jester? Do you see him as a sacred clown? Do you think that disruption is good? And I don't know if that necessarily has to do with the whole Epstein files and all of that, but it's a very interesting moment in time where we have um, a lot of kind of political resets going on, and a lot of with the attention economy, we have outrage culture, and then it kind of goes back into the roast. Can you take a joke? Is this irony sincere, or are we uh, are we just being kind of the kids on the bus that are kind of pointing and laughing?
Yeah, the I think the first time I was on Jim Rutt's show was I was pretending to be Jim Rutt, interviewing him on his own
I
show.
I remember that. Yeah.
I remember practicing the voice. But I think the first time I talked to him was that the Integral Stage had started a series called The Salon of the Refused or the Rejected, something like that, based on something that
Interesting.
happened in ancient France, not ancient France, but like uh, modern art was essentially created when the official French gallery had so many submissions from like radical new forms of art that they were rejecting because they didn't meet official standards, but they decided to make a special additional gallery for the rejected things. And that's where Manet and Monet and Cezanne and the whole thing came out of this formal incorporation of what seemed like a problematic deviation, right? And Jim Rutt was on that show because Game B had been kicked off Facebook, right? And they were struggling with being rejected. And so I've been very interested in trying to make spaces, and Bruce as well, who like is the producer of the Integral Stage and a great philosopher. Um, we've been interested in how do you fold that energy in, right? If we're
Mhm.
thinking integratively, if we're thinking beyond fragmentation, then there's some kind of role for everybody. It's not like we're
Mhm.
all equally tolerable. We all need to belong in the same space, so we all know what we're talking about in the same degree. But there's this sense of almost like benign imperialism that I have, right? I always think Caesar runs into some assassins. He thinks, good, what do I need assassins for? He runs into some thieves. He thinks, good, what do I need
Yeah.
thieves for? Right. So when I meet characters who are disruptive in the space, I personally I have a care that I take for weirdos and people on a esoteric, mesoteric kind of shamanic gradient. But I also think we need this. There's energy here. There's insight here, right? It doesn't belong everywhere, but it belongs somewhere. It needs to be recognized. It needs to be valued. It's always going to be a little bit disruptive, but this thing doesn't function unless there's both structure and disruption. So I see Farsam in that respect. Like he's a guy who has he's been around. Like he's been in a lot of these spaces. He physically goes to them. He socially networks. He proposes interactions between people. And in person, he can be an extremely engaging and entertaining and ethically driven character in this.
Yeah.
He likes to play rough with memes. All right. And that rough play sometimes is goes too far, seems mean, seems misogynist, seems to be undermining things. How much of that you permit in a given space is an open question.
Yeah.
I my general sensibility is I'm very tolerant, but I'm also happy to throw people out of spaces. Right. I don't
Yeah.
think either is a big problem. I don't think it's a huge problem that people are being upsetting. I don't think it's a problem to eject them so they go to some other digital space either. So I think we need to be experimenting with the way we structure contexts so that we can incorporate as much energy as possible without destroying the ambience that any given subset of the community requires from any particular communication niche.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you allowing me to go through um, my own journey and, not being kicked out. So, because I certainly, um, well, I just for a little context, I had a psychiatrist tell me once that they believed I was schizoaffective, but when that schizo part takes over, it's not effective, right? So um, sometimes, and I also, it took me a long time to admit that I probably was dealing with some AI psychosis as well. I went from using AI for from 2 to 4 hours a day to maybe once or twice a week, if that. And so I am on a journey kind of post AI where I still dabble, but it got the best of me there for 6 to 9 months, and I had to deal with some of the ramifications of my behaviors because of that. And so it's as somebody who identifies as a funny guy, as kind of a sacred clown, it's if you overdo that, you should arguably kind of be canceled, not canceled, but you know what I mean. People have to set boundaries, and I appreciate your um, willingness to kind of moderate those boundaries with an open mind, and offering kind of open spaces for people to experiment and for us to experiment as a collective as to, you know, in the greater kind of evolution and progress of culture. So anyway, yeah, it's been a lot of fun doing that though, as a meme artist and as somebody who writes a lot of slam poetry and has critiqued the meta modern movement, a fair bit. I used to say that, uh, meta modernism is just a vessel for gentrifiers, but I don't know if I fully agree on that, but um, I think I understand it a little better now. But in the early days, when I was trying to wrap my head around a lot of things, I said, by the time you wrap your head around all this stuff, it doesn't float and it's a lot of maintenance. But I think that's just the learning curve for kind of some of the highbrow rhetoric that's used in the scene. Um, but yeah, well, we can wrap it up. I don't want to take too much of your time. I don't know if you have any kind of closing thoughts or anything that we skipped over or anything still churning in your brain that you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think you and I could probably have some interesting conversations of a more tech-oriented nature, which is something that I never thought I was interested in, but I have enough facility in it that a lot of people come to me
Oh
with
yeah, we
aspects of what they're working out over the years. So that's maybe a different discussion that we could do. In one of the things that is still in my mind from earlier in this discussion is the role of oscillation in sincere irony.
mm,
Some of the early metamodern theorists of like the current wave, like Vermeulen and those guys, von Daniker, they they tried to suggest oscillation as a principle that described what they saw as this postmodern move. That they were looking at people, theorists and artists who were capable of sliding between really deconstructive skepticism and really like, yes, something has to be improved. There's a progress narrative. There's some kind of modern thing that can get better. And so they were looking at that. And there are other people like Jermaine Marvel who are very articulate in their critique of oscillation as a principle. They're like, as long as you're oscillating, you're not there yet. That's just a preliminary
mm,
move. And I think that's reasonable. Like if you think about it as subsystems of the brain. And then you think, well, you're going back and forth and going back and forth until they kind of wire together in a more significant way. So I see oscillation as a preliminary move, but not as fundamentally descriptive of what we're trying to do. It's not an oscillation between sincerity and irony, which would run into never really being sincere in a sense.
yeah.
But the functional simultaneity of the cognitive capacity for the irony, skepticism, intercontextual deconstruction, and the emotional and embodied capacity for full participatory engagement, both of those are necessary in order to live in the world that we now have. Right? If you're just ironic and nothing means anything and you're not really engaging, you don't live a life, you can't pass wisdom on to children, you're not really showing up. But if you're really showing up but you think it's the year 1300, you haven't taken the fact on board the fact that everything has to be deconstructed on the way in, then you also aren't really showing up. So the way to be human in the current phase is you have to be capable of all that stuff we might loop under deconstruction and irony, but that's your mental capacity. Emotionally, physiologically, you simultaneously need to be able to really engage and really take risks. And to me, it's a big, I think about this a lot around kids because every day the information landscape is less trustworthy in the sense that you can spin up at the push of a button something that sounds like a loved one asking for help or looks like evidence of a terror attack, or right, it's really becoming a problem, and that's going to keep increasing, that you can't trust what you see.
Yeah.
And how do you, so as a result, just to survive, children today have to be massively hyper skeptical.
Mhm.
But that is nothing if you can't live in the world.
Yeah.
right? And that means that emotionally and behaviorally, you've got to really be able to engage. You have to be able to touch things that make meaning and make value. So to me, sincere irony is that simultaneity of those functions and not really an oscillation.
Yeah, I think that word hits it on the head is the simultaneity, or because, yeah, you explained it perfectly. Well said. Um, because yeah, I can kind of take a joke, or you be ironic, or but also you can be sincere, but to oscillate back and forth, as you just said, but the simultaneity I think is key. Beautiful. Um, but yeah, the and I would say that that simultaneity is kind of the meso modern move, which is I think a part of meta modernism. I just like to call it meso because it's kind of the that multiplicity all at once. It's kind of almost a move to pre-modern where, we weren't so fragmented. You think a lot about like Native American culture, or just Native culture and indigenous culture, where um, in Eastern philosophy too, where the concept of spirituality doesn't even make sense because it's all already kind of a multiplicity, and it's all simultaneously, and the meaning is kind of inherent, and the integration seems to be uh, just kind of built into lifestyle. And so beautiful. But yeah, the technology would be interesting, maybe for a later date. I've noticed that Dan has infiltrated your group on Facebook, and he's been a friend of mine for 5 or 6 years now. Where we were, and at a bare minimum, he's provided me a philosophical think tank, to operate within some of his ideas. I don't know, from a business standpoint, how practical everything is, but it's certainly interesting to think about the challenge of, if game B were to actualize at scale and not just be kind of people that are just kind of off doing their own game B in a niche sense. How would we, if we were to truly have a game B planet, what type of technology infrastructure, what type of solutions are there? And so it's been fun riffing with him about potentially, you know, liquefying democracy and having kind of uh, kind of sovereign technology that is going to allow for a game B world to exist. So I don't know how deep you've gone with him, but I've noted he's kind of got a little bit of that trolling in him as well, which is interesting. The sacred clown. So um,
Yeah, he likes to poke and he likes to play. And, I think a lot on the one hand about individual subjective existential spiritual development, which is kind of the core of what I work on. But then there's the cultural ethos. What are the shared attitudes and vibes we need? But then there's the systems we need. None of that
yeah.
stuff works in the world unless there's systems, and a huge part of systems is the tech. And what is the tech that comes out of people who see and feel into vision logic spaces, whether or not those things are actually going to be the thing that can make the difference? What are the things that are absolutely the bits of tech that would be necessary to bring coherence out of the fragmentation we see? All right. What are the multidimensional implications of AI? Are there general patterns in, let's say, higher, deeper, more coherent systems and tech production relative to less sophisticated? All those are great topics. I'd love to get into them. I have some very specific ideas and a lot of open questions as well.
All right. Well, maybe we'll do that next time. Yeah. For now, we're left between our Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. So, um, yeah, I'll end with a little bit of a sentiment. May we um, may we exercise our attention in the best way we can. And I know it's simple, but you know, and my heart really does go out to the world, though, because we are hijacked, and it's hard to, oftentimes, especially where I live in a small town, to just kind of be genuine, with everybody's hypervigilance and everybody's attention being um, just kind of bombarded by a lot of the technology that is being misused. So, um, yeah, strength
Yeah,
on the journey.
may we strengthen the intentionality and the multiplicity of our attention, like to undertake it
Mm.
as exercise across multiple different kinds of systems, but also may we be able to put that down appropriately and let the results settle into us in an organic fashion. This has been a great discussion. I love
Yep.
this.
And when it does, it feels great. So,
Yeah.
um, but anyway, thanks for letting me crash in.
Yeah. Cheers, man. Thanks for the surprise.
Yeah, we'll talk soon, and I'll see you around.